Thinking Aloud. Conversations on the leading edge of knowledge and discovery with psychologist Jeffrey Mishlove.
Hello and welcome. Today we're going to pose the eternal question, what is time? And my guest, Dr. Charles Muses, is certainly an expert in this area, a mathematician, philosopher, and computer scientist, the author of numerous books and articles, including Destiny and Control in Human Systems and The Lion Path. Charles, welcome. It's a pleasure to have you on the program.
Good to be here, Jeffrey.
You know, in your book, you describe time in ways that are rather untraditional. You suggest that time is multidimensional and also that time is qualitative. Could you give an example of what you mean by the qualitative nature of time?
Yes, well, actually, this is quite traditional, but you have to go back quite a way before it becomes traditional. And it's possible to make it traditional again only with quantum physics. The idea being, I suppose, to imagine a person in a rather routine job, say in a bank or some civil service work where they're doing something much the same thing every day with the same group. But you'll hear them say, oh, today everything was just wrong. Everything went wrong today. Or today everything was smooth. So time itself, independent of the people, independently of the situation, has a quality.
Now, I might challenge that because your example doesn't really demonstrate that to me. It almost suggests that the guy, maybe he had something bad for breakfast that day.
No, the kind of a day I mean is where everything goes wrong with everybody. The boss is screaming, the different employees have a fight. There are actresses and actors can tell this too, that audiences are different. Not that it can't be overcome. But there are wave motions. It would be just as, I suppose, as reasonable to say that the oceans should have tides.
Well, tides, I suppose, must be a reflection of time in some sense.
Time and tide. Tide comes from the word time.
Is that right?
Time and tide.
Now, one of the things that you're saying reminds me of, say, the Santa Ana winds. They come in off the desert into Southern California. They're hot and dry. They carry many positive ions, which cause people to get uptight, nervous, more traffic accidents, mental illness. But would you ascribe that to the nature of time itself?
Well, you have the Föhn wind in Switzerland. You have the Sirocco in Morocco. You can predict the seasons. That's perhaps the simplest kind of chronotopology. You could predict to someone that if they went to sufficiently northern or southern latitude, without proper preparation, without the proper clothing, they would freeze to death.
You know, I should mention here,
at a certain time.
Since you've used that term, chronotopology, that's the name of the discipline which you founded, which is the study of the structure of time.
Well, do you want me to comment on that?
Yes, please.
In a way, yes, but in a way I didn't found it. I was thinking cybernetics, for instance, was started formally by Norbert Wiener, but it began with the toilet tank that controlled itself. And when I was talking with Wiener at Ravello, he happily agreed with this.
The toilet tank.
And he says, oh yes, the self-shutting off toilet tank is the first cybernetic advance of mankind.
And I suppose chronotopology has an illustrious beginning like this also.
Well, better than the toilet tank, actually. It has a better beginning than cybernetics.
Does it, in effect, does it go back to the study of the ancient astrologers?
Well, it goes back to the study of almost all traditional cultures. The word astronomia, even the word mathematicus, meant someone who studied the stars. And in Kepler's sense, they calculated the positions to know the qualities of time. But that's an independent hypothesis. The hypothesis of chronotopology is whether you have pointers of any kind, ionospheric disturbances, planetary orbits, or whatnot. Independently of those pointers, time itself has a flux, has a wave motion. And the object being to surf on time.
Now, when you talk about the wave motion of time, I'm
Yes.
getting real interested and excited because in quantum physics, there's this notion of the underlying basis of the physical universe are these waves, even probability waves, non-physical, non-material waves, sort of
It's very, very
underlie
astute
everything.
because these waves are standing waves. Actually, the wave-particle so-called paradox isn't that bad when you consider that a particle is a wave packet, a packet of standing waves.
Yeah.
And that's why an electron can go through a plate and leave wave-like things. And actually, our bodies are like fountains. The fountain has a shape only because it's being renewed every minute. And our bodies are being renewed. So we are standing waves. We're no exception.
And this deep structure of matter where we can say, you know, what we really are in our bodies is not what we appear to be. You're saying the same thing is true about time. It's not quite what it appears to be.
No, we're a part of this wave structure, and matter and energy all occur in waves, and time is the master control. I will give you an illustration of that. If you take a moment of time, this moment cuts through the entire physical universe as we're talking. It holds all of space in itself, but one point of space doesn't hold all of time. In other words, time is much bigger than space.
That thought, it's sort of making me gasp a second. All of physical space in each now
Is
moment
contained in a point of time, which is a moment. And of course, a line of time then is an occurrence. And a wave of time is a recurrence. And then if you get out from the circle of time, which Nietzsche saw, the eternal recurrence, if you break that, as we know we do, we develop. And then we're on a helix. Because we come around, but it's a little different each time.
Well, now you're beginning to introduce the notion of symbols, point, line, wave,
Yes,
helix.
the dimensions of time.
And so on. One of the interesting points that you seem to make in your book is that symbols themselves, words, pictures, point to the deeper structure of things, including the deeper structure of time.
Yes. Symbols I would regard as pointers to their meanings, like revolving doors. There are some people, however, who spent their whole lives walking in the revolving door and never getting out of it.
Can you explain that a little more?
Well, they dote on symbols per se, without ever getting to the signatum. of
Confuse
what
the map
symbol
for the
means.
territory, so to
They're
speak.
stuck in the map, yes. So you have to regard a symbol as a revolving door, the point of which is to walk through and not get stuck in it, and then help other people to get through. But a symbol is very useful, no question. But you can get caught in a revolving door. You have to be careful.
Now I've jumped a little bit because we talked about this sort of waveform property of matter and of time, and then we
Yes.
went into symbols, and I wonder if you can connect that.
Well, you need symbols to handle much of these concepts because we have words. This is the basic language. And then, as everybody knows, and most people are very petrified about, you have mathematics. And it's taught, I must say, pretty much wrongly in the elementary grades, and that's why the average person is afraid. The moment you say mathematics, oh my God, I could never understand that.
Yeah.
But that's one of the great languages, it's poetry. I asked a graduate class in Oregon a question, reminding them that the Greeks had said there was nothing, could be nothing less than nothing, and therefore negative numbers couldn't exist.
You mean like -1?
Couldn't exist. And I said, we all know we have debts, we all know we can make a car go in reverse. Prove now, though, prove that the Greeks were wrong. And they couldn't do it. They couldn't prove it. I didn't ask them to say that they were wrong, but show how they were wrong. Well, they were wrong because the Greeks were confusing two things which we are confusing. The beginning of a ruler is not the first inch. How many inches? May I ask you a question?
Yes.
What are the inches at the beginning of a ruler?
The inches at the beginning,
Yeah.
you know, you've really lost me. I'm kind of in a puzzle here. The inch at the beginning of the ruler is 0.
Right.
Yeah.
And the horse race doesn't begin at 1 mile.
Right.
It begins at the starting line.
At
So
the 0
0
point.
is as real as 1, because the edge of the ruler is as real as the first inch. The Greeks confused 0 and nothing. They were perfectly wrong to say there's nothing, right to say rather, there's nothing less than nothing, but wrong to say that that means there's nothing less than 0.
But you're saying something a little
I'm
deeper
saying
here.
0 and nothing are not the same.
What you seem also to be implying, Charles, is that in our modern day world, some of our thinking is as illogical as the Greeks, even though we pride ourselves on having a logical, rational culture.
Using the word illogical, what I said to these students is, don't think that you were stupid in not being able to see this. You had been badly conditioned In other words, this is the basis really of what the world calls brilliant thinking. It's to get into the unfamiliar. Actually, it can be quite simple, like 0 is the beginning of the ruler.
Yeah.
But it's unfamiliar because we've been conditioned. The teacher says she takes the apples away, and that's no apples, and that's the same as 0. 2 minus 2 equals 0.
Are we conditioned in the same way about time?
So we have to be careful of all our conditionings. Most of us, yes. Most of us are conditioned in the Western world of a completely linear time. Whereas in some other cultures, they have a much more circular time.
And yet we live our lives from birth to death. Isn't that sort of a linear picture?
It is a linear picture, unless you go, of course, to the Buddhist or the Hindu picture, which says death is a beginning again. And in fact, in some Islamic texts, death is the beginning of a journey. The 13th article of the Hebrew Creed of Maimonides, immortality.
Well, let me just throw an image of mine at you, and if you
Please.
can relate to this. I sometimes wonder about time. Is, for example, only if the now moment were the only real moment, that is, the past no longer exists, the future no longer exists. So I see myself, I have a physical body in the now moment, 2 arms, 2 legs. But if the past were somehow real, where did yesterday go after all? Then my body would begin to look like, almost like a long snake, and these 2 arms and 2 legs, and it would just be the front of it, and it would sort of be snaking around as if I were to draw a picture on a map of everywhere I travel today, so that in some sense, if we look at the past, we wouldn't even look the way we look if we saw time
Very,
differently.
very poetic idea.
Am I totally off base? How do you relate to that?
No, you're not at all. Using an image, of course,
Yes.
it wouldn't have to show up in the body. But the past does exist in the present, but in a different way. It exists as memory, and the future exists as desire or anticipation. But they're always in the now. There's no contradiction, in other words. The past is there. In other words, you and I are the result of previous acts we did, previous habits. We're also the result of the desires. The future is impressing itself on us right now. And that's why I mentioned in my book, there's feedback from the future.
Let's talk about that a little more. The feedback in terms of our own desires. What about precognition? What about anticipating or prophecy or
You're getting into
premonitions?
paranormal.
Yeah.
I meant even ordinary desires, but I'll return to your question, but I'd like to go by easier stages. Even an ordinary desire, if you take away the future from people, the desire, and I've seen this done under hypnosis, the person goes into terrible melancholy. There's nothing. Absolutely nothing.
No goals, nothing
No,
to look
nothing.
forward to.
We
Yeah.
live more than we realize in our desires, unachieved.
Yeah.
In fact,
It's our motivation. It
yes.
propels us as we...
Schopenhauer pushed that to the limit and said, once you achieve it, you're bored. And there's a lot of truth in that.
I
They
think
climb the
so.
mountain only to be there, then they look for another mountain.
A good example of that would be people who retire and find that they die.
Too soon.
Yeah. People
should really
live
never
18 to
retire.
24 months after
Absolutely. It's a gaseous
retiring.
system. So you're quite right that the future exists in our desires, in our anticipations, and in a very literal sense. And we are realizing it all the time. And the past does too in terms of our habits.
Now, I have another idea about the past I'd like
Yeah,
to
go
share
ahead,
with you.
please.
I think of the past as sort of a big treasure house, or sort of like in Dungeons and Dragons. I know you've written about these fantasy games
Yes.
in your book. So there's monsters and there's jewels and riches in the past. And I think as we move
image.
into the present, into the future, from the present, we have the power to take with us what we want out of the past and to leave the other stuff there. If we had times when we felt bad about ourselves or when our past was harmful or hurtful to us, we don't have to keep recalling that in our mind. We can leave it where it lay.
No, we don't have to keep recalling. Quite right. With one little proviso, we still must work through it in terms of the unconscious habits it's set up.
Yes.
That's what the lion path is about, the acceleration of the dissolution of karma, so to speak, or a consequence.
Now, you brought up the lion path. Perhaps you could elaborate on that a little bit more.
Well, that takes off from chapter 5 of Destiny and Control and goes into practical methods of how, exactly what you were bringing up, Jeffrey, how to handle the past within us, how to take what we want, how to work through what we don't want, and then leave it.
I might mention, for the sake of our viewers, Charles, that I think those two books are some of the most intriguing, interesting books I've ever read. Extremely erudite and provocative.
Glad you feel that way, though the word erudite might be a put-off. I tried to, in fact, there are 4-letter words in Chapter 5. So we tried to make it lively. It is a very lively thing. It's life itself.
Well, you're drawing scholarship that includes ancient religions and history and combines
You
that
have
with
to
a
put
lot of
that in.
mathematics and...
Especially when you go off the beaten track. But as a physician told me in London, he had written a book on regression under hypnosis.
Yes.
And I suspected there was something more than he was writing about. So I made an appointment with him, flew up to London. I was at Malta at that time. And I said, you must have meant something more in this case. He said, oh yes, this woman was very gifted. She came to me with what I diagnosed as gastric ulceritis of psychosomatic origin. And she regressed very easily. So he said, I did what I didn't write about in the book. I regressed her beyond the womb, beyond her fetal stage. And she went into a period of blankness. And then she woke up amid characteristically black Bedouin tents, which are in North Africa. And this happened again and again. So I said, would you say that was the memory of a previous existence? He said, well, he said, take from it what you will, but I couldn't publish it. My associates in Holly Street would have drowned me out.
Well, there are many books out now.
So one has to be,
Reincarnation and past
right now
life
it's all right.
regression.
You have to be very careful when you go beyond the bounds of the known, to substantiate everything doubly. So that's all that the scholarship is for. But the readers didn't have to bother with it if they didn't want to.
Now let's get back to the lion path again. You're taking off from Chapter 5 of Destiny and Control, which, is, as I recall, is the practical applications of understanding this structure of time.
And how we got into predatory time instead of symbiotic time.
You better explain that.
Well, the key to our nature system is who eats whom. And we have peace movements. We say peace is wonderful all over the world, but nature doesn't believe us. Nature is not at peace. Nature is a constant war to the death. But with another side, a completely symbiotic side, where the plants breathe out oxygen, we breathe in oxygen, we breathe out carbon dioxide, they do it. So there's beauty, and then there's predatory quality. There is this very, very blood and tooth and claw quality about it, and it needn't have been. So it arises, the question arises, if we as good scientists could have planned a symbiotic biology, what went wrong, if anything? So these are the questions that Chapter 5 tries to probe.
And what are you suggesting in the lion's path is that there's an evolution towards something other than this dog eat dog, man eat man?
Yes, there is an evolution toward a completely symbiotic state, and the thesis is that human beings are not the last stage in evolution. It would be absurd to think they were, looking around us. But that there are vistas beyond us. A dog can look above and below. He can look down at an oyster and think it's very stupid, look up to his master like a semi-god. We can only look down. So what I'm saying is we can also look up, and we have to find out where these advanced stages are.
And are you also suggesting that through disciplines that we can somehow direct or control our own evolution?
Yes, I think that's the next step for man. Man is the only creature capable of symbolic manipulation and capable of this kind of control. In fact, they're trying to do it with genetic engineering, but they're going at it from the material side rather than from the psychic side, from the mind. And I think it can be done through the mind. Well, yoga, of course, taught that for many years.
Now, let's talk a little bit about the mind, because we've been talking about time, we've been talking about space and matter and symbolism. I gather from your writing that you're suggesting that the mind is part of a sort of a non-physical reality, a mathematically definable reality, a reality that can interface and interact with physical reality, and in which physical reality is embedded.
It's very well put. In fact, only with quantum physics could we say this. But there can be some things which are physically effective which are not physical.
Can you give me
Yes, I can
example?
give you an illustration, a very recondite one, but there's called the zero-point energy of the vacuum. And the vacuum is defined in quantum physics as a space devoid of radiation or matter. No energy, no matter. Yet there's an inherent energy in there which can be measured. And this is one of the great triumphs of modern physics. And that's physically effective.
The energy of a pure vacuum.
Yes, And yet it obviously isn't a pure vacuum. The savage would say, to us, the so-called savage would say, the room is empty and the wind is a magic spirit. Well, we know it's air. So we are like the savage in saying the vacuum is empty.
Yeah.
There's something there.
Used to be called the ethers.
Yes, and then it became out of fashion. Then Dirac brought it back again because he had to. Because if you evacuate a bell jar and put a compass needle in there and then put on an electromagnet, the compass needle moved. What pushed it is the good question.
Yeah.
They don't know yet. Nobody knows.
But this is a very profound notion because in effect what we're saying is this invisible, completely non-material fabric of a vacuum is the stuff out of which the physical universe is created.
And can be effective in it.
So people who are reductionists, who suggest, for example, that the mind is made out of matter, that, that our minds are really our brains, if we go further and we say, well, what is the brain made of? The brain is made out of, in effect, a vacuum.
Yes. I know I spoke to one of these people. In fact, a chapter of mine on the interface between biology and quantum physics is coming out in a book being published by Plenum called Self-Organization. And I said to this chap, who happened to be the editor, I said, why are you getting so excited about my opposing your reductionism if you're just a lifeless matter? Why would you be so angry? This is not a characteristic of matter. This is mind. So also Konrad Lorenz had an interesting point. I was fortunate enough to have a very enjoyable dinner with him. And he, as you know, is a physician. He was trained also as a Jesuit, and he's a Darwinist. And the conversation went to precisely this point. And I asked him, would he agree that a white blood cell was an amoeba, specialized amoeba?
Oh, yes.
And
then you asked him if the
said
neuron
yes.
might also
Then,
be.
you remember that conversation?
Yeah, it was
Could the
very
neuron be
interesting.
a still more specialized amoeba with fixed pseudopods? He thought a little while longer. He said, yes, of course. And I said, then you're deriving human intelligence from amoebas. But you've just said by Darwinism that we've evolved far above them. How come?
Yeah.
So then he said, well, it's the way they're arranged.
The organization.
But you can arrange morons any way you want in a room. You don't get anything more out of them. You need an operator to impose a program on the morons.
So your point is, in effect, that the brain, being composed of these simple,
Very
relatively
simple,
simple
one-celled
neurons,
animals.
and yet the brain is, I think we'd all agree, an exquisite structure. So you're
It's
saying
a transducer, that's what I'm saying.
you're saying there must have been some other intelligence that
There
created
must
the brain.
There must be something operating it as we talk.
The notion of self-organization doesn't satisfy you. In
No,
this
not
regard.
not when the self is the one-celled animals that are supposed to pull themselves up by their own bootstraps.
But Charles, when we're looking at the nature and structure of time, there's so many threads to the fabric. There's our brain, there's our language, there's the structure of matter itself, and all of these various waveforms to which you referred. You seem to be implying that it's possible for human beings to get a grip on all of these things, to have a handle on all of these various facets using some very sophisticated version of systems theory, I
That's
think.
the way the book had to be written, and it is that way, but that's a post hoc thing. The real way you get a handle on it is not through the intellect, but through the feelings. In other words, the poet grasps the world as a whole much more accurately and profoundly than the average scientist. That's what I'm really saying. And that the human being has to filter things through the heart, through the emotions, before the logic even gives assent to it. If you're talking with even a very intelligent man, if he or a woman, if he or she is against what you say emotionally, you can talk all night. The logic won't avail. So it's the emotions where the key to human development lies, rather than the intellect.
Are you then going a step further and suggesting that if we can cultivate this emotional sensitivity to the rhythms and the cycles and patterns of time, that this may have practical benefit for us in our government, in our culture, in our businesses?
Oh yes, it would eliminate fear. It would increase our intellect. For instance, you can train a dog through affection much better than you can train it through fear. Its intelligence will develop with affection. Everybody who has a dog knows that and loves them.
And in making business decisions.
Whereas with fear, which is the basis of present-day governments, thou shalt not do this. If you do this, you'll get a fine. If you don't pay this, we'll
much of the
come after you.
marketplace is
it's all fear.
driven by fear as
That's
well.
right. And what I'm saying is that fear is paralytic, and if you want to call it love, but not in a sentimental sense, like a cosmic power, is unfolding, is a blossoming effect. And that's what we need. Children, of course, immediately respond to that. We all know that. If you try fear, you'll just lock them up. Also, the feeble-minded, also people who tend to be neurotic or psychotic, they all respond negatively to fear.
Would I be too crass to try and to push your argument in this direction, to say, let's
No,
suppose
push away.
you haven't heard me yet, but suppose
I don't mind.
I'm buying or selling stocks, bonds, commodities. I'm in the marketplace of the world. I'm in business. Would you recommend that I cultivate a sense of emotional relationship to the market, try and feel the group mind or what other people are doing, the cycles of time?
Well, for one thing, the cycles could be calculated. But where I inculcate the emotion is when you're dealing with human beings.
Yeah.
The stock market, of course, is a reflection of human beings, but it's not dealing directly with them. So I would say it was a misplaced analogy. But the stock market cycles can be studied, yes, indeed. But they go in turn back to emotional cycles, because when people lose faith in a business or in a given money, the stock market drops, even if the money still has value or the business has value. There's a psychological overlay on the stock market of emotion.
What are the directions? We've talked about the further evolution of the human being, which seems sort of very lofty and really in a way spiritual. What are some of the other directions in which chronotopology, the discipline that you've named, is moving today?
Well, getting teams together, choosing teams that can work well together, that have destiny patterns that would harmonize. You'd cut down very much on airplane accidents.
Team building.
Yes, team building, and putting those who are, even insurance companies have learned there are people who are accident prone. They don't know why, but they know it. And so you'd get maybe only one of these on a team. Don't put the majority of accident-prone people together on one team. And then you steer away events. This is the theory. You would actually steer away because the event is attracted to the type of destiny pattern of the person. You may have often wondered why the victims of many horrible crimes are usually, very often, very nice, innocent people. And the Hindu theory saying that they must have been very bad in some past life and therefore deserve this doesn't hold up. When you look at the cases, the victims usually are pitifully innocent, often naive. Well, when you see lightning going through a sky and it seems very zigzag, what it's actually doing is not zigzagging at all. It's finding the place of least resistance through the air.
It's following a structure.
So if a person has no resistance around them, then the evil lightning the will of somebody who's destructive can find them better. This is the theory.
Charles, it's been a pleasure having you with us on the program. We've really covered a lot of ground, from quantum physics to poetry to history.
Thanks to your questions.
Thank you very much for being with us.
Pleasure.
And thank you as well for being with us today.